this iconic strait gives it, I think, a lot of kudos. I grew up swimming in the straits, jumping into the straits when crab fishing and so on. And there are issues around water cleanliness, for example, that are of real interest to lots of different groups, fishing groups, stand-up paddle boarders and canoeists like myself, plus everybody interested in making sure that the natural environment of the Strait thrives. So I'm pleased that we have this partnership forum. I'm pleased that Welsh Government has funded this through the Coastal Capacity Building Fund. It is about building capacity in answering or bringing about answers to problems and issues around the Strait. Dwi'n dymuno dda iawn i'r grŵp yma. Dwi'n edrych ymlaen I wrando ar yr cyflwyniadau heno, byddai'n gorfod gadael yn gynnar mae gen I gyfarfod arall I fynd gyda fo heno yma. Ond fel dwi'n dweud, mae partneriaeth wastad yn beth da, a dwi'n disgwyl I bethau cadarnhaol ddod allan o'r partneriaeth yma mewn blynyddoedd I ddod. Felly pob hwyl I chi, a dwi'n edrych ymlaen.
Has teamed up with the North Wales Rivers Trust to develop this forum. As Freen has said, we're using some funding from the Welsh Government's Coastal Capacity Building Challenge Fund, which is administered through Anglesey Local Nature Partnership, and we're very grateful for the help they've provided in providing that funding. As you know, the Menai Strait is a wonderful place, and the ecosystem there supports a whole range of different services, and businesses, wildlife and leisure activities. All of these activities rely on good water quality and sustainable use of the strait. But it's always at risk from a whole range of sources and factors, including climate change, which we all know about, causing increased floods and droughts and affecting sea temperatures. It's affected by agricultural land use and sometimes inappropriate development has an effect on the quality of life. The aim of this forum is firstly to better understand the current status of the strait and also the river catchments that run into it. The approach we're taking is we're not just considering the strait itself, but the rivers on each side, on Anglesey and the mainland, because what goes into the rivers ends up in the strait. So it's important that we take an integrated approach to that. So we want to influence, we want to empower, and we want to be part of the solution. So it's not about blaming people for things, it's about working together to try and find solutions. And we want your views as well. We have views on what the important factors are, but I'm sure there's a whole range of views as well. What are the issues? What are the potential solutions? And we want your active participation as well. So, to help you think about those questions, we've invited a number of speakers to give their views on a whole range of issues, and we've called them the Voices of the Menai. So this is their view of the Menai Strait, and hopefully it will give you an idea of some of the issues that the Strait is facing. So with that, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Rebekah Booth, who works for...
Hi, I'm Rebekah. I'm the Education and Public Engagement Coordinator at the season. I'm here to talk about biodiversity for Menai Strait. So Menai Strait is in an area of outstanding natural beauty and is a special area of conservation. section. You can just see it here. It's unique and it has a 4-fathom banks complex in that in between the mainland of Wales and Anglesey, it's quite sheltered, but it's still in an area of open coast. There is high turbidity throughout the strait when there's spring tides, where they can reach up to 8 knots as well, which helps the biodiversity. So it's home to a range of species, some with commercial value such as fisheries and tourism. And due to the turbidity, we can get some unique organisms here that you can't find growing to such an extent, such as the breadcrumb sponge. So in the strait they can be found single colonies up to 1 metre squared, which is unusually large. Here we have Carnarvon and Beaumaris. We have areas of dwarf eelgrass, which is a national important biotope for species such as seahorses and juvenile fish. And not due to anything, in the sandy inner shores you can find that it's dominated by polychaetes, and this one is Steophyrocolnis. So yeah, they have ecological and economical importance as well, such as like the mussel fisheries and different fishes, species with commercial value. When there's a year with especially high bivalves, the common scoter can be found grazing and exploiting these sandbanks to feed. Home to nursery grounds, place you can find Red Wolf Bay, which is just out of the Menai Strait, but it's still an important nursery grounds for the juvenile fish as well. So tourism and pleasure, we have a range of charismatic species which can be found all throughout the strait, which businesses use for tourism values. So we have everyone knows the puffin cruises, so you can see like harbour horses and bottlenose dolphins. There we are. The most common mammal is the grey seal, which you can see pretty much everywhere. We have a European importance of wintering oyster catches as well. So a little bit about climate change. Climate change will affect biodiversity, or can affect the biodiversity of areas, and that's all we're seeing at the minute is how our oceans are negatively impacted by climate change. So these are some of the factors. We've got sea level rise, bleaching, toxic algae, habitat loss, acidification, and then the impact from fisheries. The marine environment is more sensitive than terrestrial ecosystems to climate change, since the ocean responds on shorter timescales to atmospheric changes. Recent experiments suggest that the combined effects of climate change reduce water quality and lower the resilience of temperate species to perturbations such as storms and diseases, which are expected to increase with climate change issues. So yeah, impact on the Menai Strait. There has been seen to have an increase in suspended particulate matter in recent years. It is a lot organic, however, the majority of it is inorganic, which is going to have an impact on species such as the filter feeders, which are dominated. Also, we've got biological invasions of non-native species, and that's described as one of the most significant components from global climate change. So you can see you've got slipper limpet and Sargassum uticum there. So displacements of species. The large mud flats at either end of the strait have charismatic fauna and flora that exploits a rich community of feeding birds. So going back to the invasive species as well, if this was to affect like the bivalves, such as the suckling pits, then that will cause knock-on effects to higher trophic levels of organisms. And then that means could lead to reduced business in fisheries and tourism due to the increased efforts in trying to clean shellfish, or just their worth going down. Here are some references. Thanks for listening.
The reason you're probably wondering is why the Rivers Trust is involved in this project with MSFOMA. One of the major reasons is there are 13 rivers, which I'll talk about in a minute, that flow into the Strait. Now the Strait is tidal, as you well know, but the pollutants that are going into there are most probably from the rivers that enter. So rivers carry not only the good stuff, the nutrients for wildlife, or further down the catchment, but they will also carry all of the other pollutants that you probably don't want in a river. And I'll talk about two of the major ones. There are numerous issues affecting water quality, I'm sure you'll all know globally, but there are two major ones, particularly within this catchment, that I'm going to talk about today, and hopefully together we can come up with some solutions of what to do about them. So there are 13 rivers that flow into the Menai. As a Rivers Trust, we're committed to improving all the rivers within our catchment and looking for funding to do that. And the rivers that flow in suffer from different sources of pollution. So as you can see, on the mainland side, you have the three major rivers. It's mountainous, so you have different issues with acidification at the top of the catchment, which is not what I'm going to talk about much today. And that's mountainous. And on the other side of Anglesey, you have the smaller tidal rivers, and a lot of those, there's a lot of farmland around those, and there's a lot of tourism, and we'll talk about septic tanks briefly. So there's two very different issues going on with the rivers within our catchment. So if we're looking at the catchment of the Menai Strait, that's specifically what we look at. So if you're looking at the three major ones, you have the Sian, Iorwerth, you've got the Iorwerth, the Great on the other side. Those are your major rivers. We have lots of smaller rivers, and particularly this one here in the south catchment of Anglesey has been classed as poor quality in particular. So some of the things that we've already mentioned, and I'll keep this very brief, is one of the major effects that we've got is climate change. So we've seen the hottest summers, which are causing drought, but we've also seen massive kind of rainfall, and it's only going to get worse. So when that happens, you've got major kind of downpouring of rain, and that's going to bring with it different sediment, and it's going to increase CSO overflow. So I'm going to talk about those two things specifically, because those are two things I think within this catchment that we should be looking at. So a combined sewer overflow, there are numerous along the rivers, and they do flow straight into the Strait. Now a combined sewer overflow, I won't go into too much detail, but they should only release in a high flow, so high rainfall. But when we've been looking at the statistics for the rivers on those catchments that I just showed you, the statistics for the releases are very high. So in the latest set of figures, we're still waiting for last year's to come out, but in 2021, there were 42,631 hours of combined sewage overflow was released. That's not just sewage, that's also rainfall, impermeable surfaces. I'll talk about that in a minute. So every time they flow, they get mixed up with the sewage, they're partially treated. Sometimes they're monitored. Recovery are better than some of the other water boards at monitoring the outflow. But you can see there was 4,913 spills. So they should only ever spill when there's heavy rainfall or high flows. But from the data we've looked at, that's not necessarily always the case. It is an archaic system that we know that we have to replace, but if we're looking at it in terms of practicalities in the next few years, it's going to cost around 36 billion just for Wales, just alone to replace the CSO system. And that's not looking at all the other things to do with water quality. So it's a huge issue. So one of the things we do look at is slowing the flow of water. So the one thing that we can do is look at ways to not only purify the water through nature-based solutions, but also slow the flow. So if you're looking at urban areas like Bangor, you've got concrete, you've got impermeable surfaces. Hopefully none of you have got that plastic grass in your gardens, because it's just going to hit it in a high rainfall, it rushes straight into the CSO overflow, and you're going to get more spills. Another issue that we do have is obviously the land use around here. You've got a lot of farms and agriculture, so that's not just cattle farming, it's sheep farming, and with that comes lots of different issues. I don't have time to go into too much today, but we do have it on our website. So with agriculture, they obviously are using more fertiliser and nutrients to improve the soil. The soil in high rainfall gets washed straight off into the river, so that also increases the potential for eutrophication in the river and blooms. You also have the agriculture. We currently are planting and trying to do buffer zones to kind of cool down the rivers, but also to act as, with wetland buffer zones, they act as water filters, so they filter the water before it reaches there. But we're also trying to work with farmers to improve soil quality. So if they've got compacted soils, so that could be from machinery, it could be from like the hooves, sheep and cattle, when it hits the floor, it runs straight off into the river. So we're trying to work with them to improve the soil quality so it's free draining, so it captures more of the water. So there are things that we can do from a Rivers Trust point of view, from a nature-based point of view. But one of the things we are looking at, or hoping to do, but hopefully a lot of you are experts, I know some of you in the audience, can help us come up with some solutions. But if we need to start thinking about the entire catchment, so we can no longer think of just the Menai Strait. You need to think from the very tops, where you've got the mountainous areas, all the way through. They're all heading straight into the Menai Strait. Whether that's tidal or not, at some points you've got the swellies and there is sediment. I think Rachel already mentioned it. You will have pockets, areas here, especially around this area, where those pollutants are going to start to pool. So we need to start thinking of it as an entire catchment approach. So that's why the Rivers Trust is involved, and I think you'll agree that probably looking at those stats that I've shown you, that the rivers are one of the main key pollutants for the Strait, and there are many issues affecting it. One thing I will say that we haven't really gone into is tourism hits this area at certain times of the year, as you well know. There'll be caravan parks that are relying on either small package plants or they'll be relying on septic tanks. Not all of them are registered, not all of them are maintained, and those also leach out into the soils and then into the waterway. I don't want it to seem too negative, but there's numerous other things that I could go into which I've added to our website, but you're looking at different things like pesticides, litter, which I know Sian's going to talk about. All of those things are flowing in from the rivers. So when we come to the solutions at the end, Osham's going to put some boards up there. If you start thinking as you're listening to things, what kind of solutions can you think about? And not just putting a plaster at the final solution, but thinking all the way up the catchment of what interventions can go into place. Because there's no point clearing up this area if it's still pouring in from the rivers. Thank you.
First of all, welcome. This is home to me when I'm at work. So welcome here to the University of Marine Centre Wales. I've got a few minutes. I've got given longer than everyone else. I don't know why. So ask me to fill space, and I will. And I'm a scientist, so there can be some graphs. I apologise now. I'll try and explain them as we go through. I'm going to focus also really nice intro there from Nora. I'm going to keep going on the water quality theme, and just look at some of the evidence we have for water quality in the Strait, and also point some of the gaps in information as well. I put this one up as just a starter. This is not what I'm talking about, but it's something we get asked about most summers. Those of you who are on the Strait a lot will be familiar with the algal blooms, the photosynthesis blooms that occur usually in late May and early June that can form slicks in the Strait. That's common around the coast here of Wales, and this is a news story from Pembrokeshire that's on the BBC. I just plundered one web page this morning to have a look at an example. Every year you'll see news stories. People phone in and say, we think there's a big sewage spill, there's brown material in the Strait. It's not usually. It's not that visible pollution in the summer. Is likely to be a natural phenomenon rather than a pollution phenomenon. What I want to focus on is exactly what we've just been hearing about from the Rivers Trust, which is the problem of land source contamination from a range of sources, and how that affects water quality and how it affects shellfish production. What's quite interesting is, I was thinking about this and I was looking for information. There isn't much public information in the sense of routine monitoring of water quality contamination, in the sense of how much pollution from agriculture and from human sources is ending up along the coast. This inset map here is all the bathing water, classified bathing water beaches around the North Wales coast. You can see that we have one at each end. We have Newborough, we have Densley, we have Llanfyddachan, but within the Strait, there's no designated bathing waters. Bathing waters are monitored only during the summer season. If you look at the graphs on the right, you can see they go from May through to October. And what they're measuring is bacteria, coliform bacteria, both E. coli and intestinal enterococci, which come from humans or animal sources, from gut, end up through sewage or agricultural sources in coastal waters, mediated through the rivers. Generally, we have very good bathing water quality around the North Wales coast, with some exceptions. So I picked up one at the closest one to where we are now, which is at Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwyrndrobwllllantysiliogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogogo and there's some thresholds that need to be not be exceeded for that, which is not more than 250 E. coli bacteria per 100 mils of seawater, and there's a slightly lower number for the enterococci. So that's good news. You will notice though, it's based on the last 4 years' data. If you look at the bottom right graph here, so bottom right tube graph, there was a month in the middle of August where those numbers were exceeded. That blue dot that's sitting a bit higher, if you were swimming off Lamberbecken in August 2019, you might have been in some fairly unclean water. So it does happen, even though it's classified as excellent. But the other reason I put this up is we really don't have data for in the strait itself, not for water quality, but there are quite a few shellfish sampling points. Shellfish sampling points are different. So where shellfish are farmed or gathered commercially, those sites have to be monitored because those shellfish are going to end up in the human food supply chain. People are going to eat them. And so under the auspices of the Food Standards Agency, there's a sampling regime. And you can see here, I put in a couple for mussels. All these, on top right one, all those map markers along the Menai Strait and over to Conwy and up in Penryn Bay in Holyhead. And on the bottom left, the markers on again in the Strait and across to the Dee. We've got mussels on the top right and cockles. So they sample different species depending on which site those are being produced out or fished out. This is kind of, these are useful data sets. These go back decades and they give us a picture really of change in patterns of pollution and spatial patterns of pollution. Again, without going into too much detail, the classifications, it's not like the excellent grading in bathing waters. This is based on Class A, B and C. I think all those shellfish sites are Class B, except for one patch in the Menai Strait, which sometimes of the year is a Class A. And what that is showing is that the majority of the samples fall between, are below 200, they're actually in the data we get, maybe we'll explain it better. I've got a plot. This is a plot here. This is actually for one of the sites in the Menai Strait, in the Menai East. That's the mussel production area. These blue dots are the sampling data. Most of the results are below 230 counts per 100 grams of shellfish flesh. That's very good. That's Class A. But we get some which are above that, and it's the frequency of those slightly higher results which push it into being a B classification. So the bottom line is we have B classified shellfish waters, but not really bad B class waters. They're on the threshold. They could potentially be tipped into being A class if we could do something about those occasional high numbers that occur. So that's kind of really the future, if you want, is like the canary in the coal mine. We have mussels in the Strait. We look at what's happening to the mussels, we can get a good idea of water quality, and we can also look at trends over time, whether we're getting better or worse water quality. As just been pointed out in the previous talk, the pollution that contaminates both bathing waters and shellfish are from a range of sources. They're mostly in the pictures on the right. There's spreading of slurry from agricultural sources. There's the combined sewage, CSO combined sewage overflows. There's some others which are maybe minor, depends where you are. The seabirds themselves can be a source of pollution in terms of gut bacteria. And to some extent, if recreational boaters aren't behaving themselves, you can have spills from boats as well. And this, I think, reflects the point about the catchment. There's a whole range of different sources. The red dots are the assets of the Dŵr Cymru. We have all these stars on here which represent private septic tanks. We have birds representing high population bird areas. So we have a real mix of sources that could all be the origins of the contamination that we're seeing in shellfish within the Strait. So, what sort of levels are we talking about? Well, I think let's look at the river. So we've had a project running for the last year, which just finished in December, so I've got some sort of hot off the press data here. This is where the graphs start, I'm afraid. This map shows us where the hatched area is the mussel production area, the Bangor mussel producing area. And you can see the sampling points in yellow. Those are the routine sampling points that are sampled every month by for the Food Standards Agency. And we looked at the 3 rivers which mostly affect that mussel production area, we think, which are the 3 there, the Adur, the Cain and the Ogwen. And these plots here are the E. coli, gut bacteria measured in the water flowing out of those rivers. I think the main thing I went at is just look at these scales. So I talked about the threshold for excellent bathing water quality being not more than 250 E. coli per 100 mil. Here we're seeing values going up to 100,000 in the Adur, coming out from under Bangor. We have regularly values sitting around 1,000 in the Ogwen. So we have high levels, and you've got to remember the actual input of bacteria into the strait is not just the concentration in this river water, it's the river flow as well. So that's that times the volume gives you the contamination level. Climate change, this is not really sort of a climate change point. What happens when it rains? So when we get high rainfall, which is the middle graph here, this is a rain event in May last year. We had a peak in rainfall. You can see that's the middle plot. The bottom plot shows the water level in the river rose. This is the Ogwen following that rainfall. And we can see in the top, we also then get a big peak in E. coli coming out of the river at that point. That's because, most likely, 2 things are happening. High rainfall means more runoff from agricultural land. It means more overflow from the CSOs. We're in the process of trying to work out to what extent each is contributing. Interestingly, though, if you go and look, so we went out into the middle of the strait and we went at high tide and we took samples from the surface water at high water over the mussel beds at some of the sampling points. Here we have 6 of those points. They're all being monitored. This is like taking a sample of water off a boat and saying how much bacteria is in that. The interesting thing here is once you get to high tide and the water has been flushing through the strait, we don't get any values above 100. So all of these look like they're fairly close to or within the bathing water excellent criteria. But that doesn't stop there being pollution of the mussels, because this is the sort of the most dilution that we get. You've got to remember that what's happening is the rivers are coming down into the strait. It may be low water or the water's receding, and you've got high concentrations of effluent in that river water that's receding over the shellfish beds, and then it's filling up. And at high water is when you've got the most dilute. But there are periods with much higher levels, clearly, because if you look at what's happening in those shellfish beds, you do see high levels of these are bacterial levels of E. coli in shellfish on those same points, and we do get quite high values, which are pushing us up into the high end of the B classification on occasion, and this is what's stopping the shellfish beds being classified as A. So it seems to be, and this is what we're trying to work out, is we're working towards how do we predict how much of a rainfall event, at what time, under what conditions, may result in high results in the shellfish, which might help shellfish farmers decide whether they should harvest or not. It's not just at the northeast end. If you go to the southwest end of the strait, this is looking down towards Carnarvon. What these red bubble plots are showing us, this is some data from a survey done by CFAS back in 2013, which makes the point, again, we're quite limited in what data we have actually to look at what's happening in terms of trends within the strait. These are showing water samples at small rivers and outfalls along the strait, and this is showing, if you get the larger size, that's 10,000 E. coli counts per 100 mil. The smaller ones is 1,000. Remember that the bathing water excellent rating is nothing more than 250. So all of these are showing, you can imagine a situation, depending on the state of the tide, people using the strait in these areas might get exposed to high levels of contamination at particular states of the tide, and depending on the weather and river runoff as well. This is going to work. Hopefully. There we go. So you can see this, you can visualize it. So we have people who work in this building who are modelers who look at dispersal of viruses and bacteria in the transition between coming down the rivers and what happens when they get to the sea. And what that, if you look over time, if you look at the inset panel, I think he says confidently, this is going to work. Go on, play. No, it's not going to play. Of course. Never put a video in a demo. I'll tell you what it was going to show you. These are animations which show the dispersal from point sources, and what it was going to show is here in the strait, if you look around where the shellfish beds are, if you get a big output of polluted water from one of the river sources, that's from where the Ogwen enters, what happens is it actually gets diluted and dispersed quite quickly. But if you go to out into Conway Bay, that's Rebekah, where the red patch is in the middle of the plot there, that tends to slosh back and forwards for days afterwards, and it can take a long time for it to get mixed up and dispersed. So it does depend on the current flow conditions in any particular spot. Right, I guess the take-home message about the normal ways we measure water quality, which is E. coli and gut bacteria, is that it can be the very high loadings into the strait. It does affect shellfish, it maintains in a Class B classification. I think James Wilson's going to talk about a bit more in a minute. Also, that we do have potential for very high occurrences in and around, right, particularly on the edge where people might be, recreational users might be exposed to pollution. But in the middle, at high tide, we are fortunate that it's quite a highly flushed system and well mixed, and that does disperse and mix bacteria that get into the strait. I'm just going to finish on a slightly different topic, sounds a bit more menacing. The point is that E. coli is not what really makes people sick by eating shellfish. It's an indicator. It's supposed to show us what's the amount of contamination coming from livestock and from human sources into coastal waters. Largely, it's norovirus. It's a virus that makes us ill. I think winter vomiting disease that we can all catch. If it's in the human population, it can end up in wastewater, and it can end up in the rivers, and it can end up in the strait in the same pathway as the bacteria. These are plots, the red plots here for these various spots in the Menai Strait. The red plots is how much E. coli is in the shellfish. And we've been measuring norovirus levels, and that's the little, doesn't matter which colour they are, the dots, if they're red or blue, show norovirus levels in shellfish. The point to notice here is mostly the norovirus levels are very low. They're all ticking along around zero. It doesn't really matter what the E. coli, because you may have sewage spills, but if there isn't norovirus in the human population, then you've not got a health risk from norovirus being transmitted into shellfish. But you can have periods where you've got low E. coli numbers, but high amounts of norovirus in shellfish, so that's not particularly the greatest indicator. And you can have it the other way around. You can have high E. coli numbers, but actually no norovirus present in the shellfish. Which kind of leads into some other work that's been done in the university. I thought I'd just mention at the end, which is the university got involved. There was kind of a pathway from looking at the fate of viruses in wastewater and how those end up in rivers and how they end up in shellfish. During COVID, that switched to monitoring viruses in wastewater from a public health point of view, because it was a very good way of monitoring how much COVID there was in the human population. That work's now been extended, and it's a case of, here locally, it's going to Rebekah at Sewage Treatment's works, doing routine sampling every day, many times each day in fact, and monitoring for presence both of viruses, norovirus particularly, but also still looking for SARS and other less common viruses, also looking for antimicrobial resistant bacteria, which might come from the hospital or from the human population, general population, monitoring those because those can end up in discharges either from CSOs if they overspill. Many viruses don't survive sewage treatment, some do, depends which virus you're looking at. And if there's spills, then they all will end up in the environment, which could be invaded water, but they could be in shellfish. And that's a project which is ongoing, which is largely focused at the moment on surveillance and tracking the sources of human pathogen contamination in wastewater, and then looking at what the risks are that in terms of modelling, microbial risk assessment modelling, and looking at how infectious the virus is actually. Is it actually a health risk once it's been through a sewage treatment work? Will it actually make someone sick? That's just to kind of highlight something else that's got ongoing in the university at the moment.
Sykes with Sian this year. So many people know Sian from her paddleboarding exploits, but you're going to talk about litter.
Yes, thank you.
Hi everybody, good evening. So I'm representing two hats. So I'm originally from Wales, and I followed a dream of advertising in Manchester and London, and so disconnected from where I grew up. And I changed career, and I've discovered paddleboarding, and now I run a business on the Menai Strait, introducing people to the joys of paddleboarding and nature to reconnect them with themselves. From paddleboarding, we see firsthand what's been washed up on our beautiful beaches, and I got really upset about seeing how, when I was younger, the beaches were so lovely and not polluted, and now you see everything washed up in the incoming tide, and I wanted to make a difference. So I joined Surfers Against Sewage. They're an environmental charity, and they're real activists, and they get things done. So I helped with doing community groups with beach cleans. Here's some shocking stats about what's going on in the environment. You can take a look at that. But I wanted to get involved, and I wanted to stop at source, because it's all very well doing beach cleans. However, we've still got an ongoing tap, and we had people getting involved and getting angry. However, for me, it's about freeing up our consumption, being a disposable society, and be conscious about when we're going to the supermarkets, shops, what we're actually buying and consuming. The offenders, and this is what we've also seen on the Menai Strait, the classic is plastic bottles, straws, cotton bud sticks, balloons, sachets, plastic carrier bags. Here we did a beach clean at Menai Point, and all those cotton bud sticks I picked up with probably within 5 minutes, within a metre by a metre at Menai Point. And people have been treating, toilets as a bin, and people don't realise those plastic cotton bud sticks last in the environment for about 150 years. However, I just saw the whole sand dunes just littered with plastic cotton bud sticks. It's great that companies are now being responsible and making changes, finding alternatives, but we have to think, do we actually really need it in the first place? But it's actually there in the environment, and it's breaking down into microplastics. I've been working hard. In 2019, I was the lead for helping to get Surfers Against Sewage recognised here on the island as a plastic-free island, so we're committed to minimising our impact on the environment. We've still got a long way to go, but we were the first county in the UK to be awarded that, which was amazing because it allowed me to communicate with organisations, schools, just to educate them about single-use plastics, for them just to be aware about the impact they're causing by the decisions they make. It was great to see businesses get involved. Then if I switch on back onto my paddleboarding hat, for me the joy is about introducing people into paddleboarding. It's about allowing people to connect with nature, because we've seen a massive increase of the people who've engaged and got upset when they, with David Attenborough highlighting the issues. People have been getting annoyed because they see it on the beaches. So it has been a lot of people talking about it, and I think because they can connect to it, been rallied on, because they've been connected to it, because they get upset seeing plastic bottles. So this is us on the Menai Strait. We stopped off for a panad. I encourage people to do a litter pick, and and they get upset about it, but they also feel like they're doing something good. Plastic bottles last in the environment for about 450 years. These are the type of plastics we find. Would you believe these are tyres? I don't know if anybody's seen that on the Menai Strait. Between Bwyd Mor and Menai Bridge, people are actually tipping tyres. People thought it was their way of collecting crabs, but no. They've just been dumped, and apparently there's been mattresses dumped as well. Again, my lovely customers wanted to do something, so we all helped by carrying these tyres back to Gallows Point, and luckily, spoke to the council and they collected it. So at least we were stopping those breaking our environment. One thing I want to sort of talk about is with the tide, it brings in obviously the seaweed, and here you think that's a good picture of seaweed. However, if you look closely, we're starting to see lots of microplastics, and for me that's the most depressing thing about it all. It's in the water, people think they're doing good by recycling. However, things are entering into our oceans all the time. It really upset me. Last year, I saw a seagull, and it was just wrapped around with ghost gear fishing line, and it couldn't drink, it couldn't fly, it was tangled, and I managed to capture it and clip it off the ghost gear, but for me, you know, this is on my home patch and we want to look after it. The Menai Strait is so stunning and it is a wonderful destination, and we're all here because we love the environment, and we want to do what we can do to protect it. So for me, what we need to do is break our connection with being a disposal society, really think about what we're going to do and the consequences it has. And I'm really pleased that there's a big attendance tonight, because we've all got a voice and we can all make a difference. For me, it's about engaging with people. We can't shout louder, we just have to have a different way of communicating. So for me, working with school groups, trying to educate them to come up with some solutions and suggestions. For me, I'd like to work with the council to have better bin facilities, because I don't know about you, but recycling bins always fall over in the strong winds and then they enter into the gutters and then they end up out in the sea. Better waste management, so for example, for trade users, that they're not doing fly tipping, make it more accessible for people. Have a deposit return scheme. It would be great to have a station here in Menai Bridge, so it's an incentive for people to actually get money back and do something good by picking up the plastic bottles. Am I done?
Is James Wilson. James is a mussel farmer on the Menai Strait, among other things. So he's going to talk about the plight of the mussels, I think. James?
Thanks, Alan. And you know, so it is great to see so many people here, though. It's also not so great to be last speaking, because, particularly after Lewis, because my presentation was very small at the beginning, now it's a lot smaller. So I don't want to duplicate the slides. Alan, maybe that was a deliberate ploy, because you did say that we're not here to blame anybody, but I do like my rant, so I'm allowed to sort of fill in the space by just blaming people. It's my thing. I guess the first thing to say is there's nothing new about poor water quality around the coast. It's great to hear Sian's talk, though, because it reminds you that water quality hasn't been good for a long time, but now it's probably we get more inputs, different things that are affecting it. So the microplastics issue is definitely a more modern issue. I think society's woken up to it. It'll take some time to deal with that. But to be honest, we're not dealing with the principal issue, which is how we use the sea as a dumping ground for our sewage. This is something that's been occurring since the late 1800s. Population expansion overwhelmed the sewage network. The sea was the easy place to go, and it basically continued unabated for most of the 20th century until, ironically, the UK entry into Europe and European regulations brought around a kind of step change in the way that we looked at water quality around the coastlines, UK and Europe. So, we were known as a dirty man of Europe. Some people are making that point again, that we're perhaps heading back that way, unfortunately. So, Laura mentioned the idea of catchment management, and I'm sitting next to Aaron, and I just maybe perhaps Aaron can remind me, but I can remember when NRW were first formed, I thought the principal driving objective of NRW was a catchment to coast approach, wasn't it? So that was how many years ago now? 10. And we're still talking about it. So I think this is what we do in Wales, the UK, particularly Wales. Talk a lot, we have some really good ideas. Acting on them perhaps is a lot harder to do, but it's good we're still talking about it anyway. So I've got a very minimalist presentation anyway, so it's just really about what water quality means to mussels. So firstly, really, I'm not very techy, I have to say. There we go. Okay, so what are mussels? Mussels are a filter feeding bivalve. They're quite sessile, but filter feeding means they extract all their nutritional requirements from the environment in which they exist. So the more nutrient rich the environment is, the more happy, or the happier the mussels are. They suck in sort of indiscriminate amounts of particulate matter. The particulate matter that isn't got nutritional content for them, they then excrete back out bound in a mucus. It's called pseudofeces. It becomes this thing called pseudofeces, which then forms a sort of a organic muddy bed on which they sit. That process prevents the sort of inorganic or unuseful material being sort of recycled constantly into the animal and causing starvation. So when they're in a nutrient-rich environment, they can grow really, really fast. So the mussel on the bottom of this picture was about 2 months old, and the mussel on the top of this picture, which was, and it's about 10 mils in size. The mussel on the top of this picture, which is about 75 mils in size, is 10 months old. So those are mussels grown not in the strait, but just offshore from the strait, but very, very high nutrient requirement, and that's why that's just how mussels recycle nutrients. So how does that then? What does that mean to us in respect of how does that relate back to water quality? So obviously mussels are a food. You know, we like to eat mussels. Clearly, if the water's highly contaminated, then they're probably not so good to eat. What Lewis referred to the fact that most of the growing areas in the Menai Strait are designated as what's called Class B, so quite clean, but not clean enough to consume without further treatment. There's a process called depuration where the mussels are immersed in ultraviolet treated water for a period of time, 42 hours. 42 hours is the standard that's applied in the UK, although other European countries apply different time frames to it. Once the mussels have been through that, then all the contaminated, or the bacterial contaminated bacteria inside the animals has been flushed out, and then they're safe to eat. However, with mussels, as Lewis also sort of touched upon, once bivalves are cooked, cooking destroys a lot of the pathogens in the animal. So even if you eat contaminated or bivalves from a contaminated area, not that I'm recommending that you should, if you cook them and you cook them effectively, then that really diminishes the risk that you might face as a consumer. So what does that mean in effect? So prior to Brexit, because nobody's actually mentioned it before, which is about the first time I've been to a presentation or event in several years where nobody's really mentioned Brexit. Prior to Brexit, Class B for us in the Menai Strait was acceptable. We were part of the single market, we applied the same, we were inside the framework of the European regulations, and so we were able to export Class B mussels unhindered into the European market. And unfortunately, for reasons that we've been working on, or reasons that we've never really bottomed out, but things we've been working on for some time to try and sort of readdress, people just don't eat enough shellfish, seafood generally in the UK. So our markets were always overseas, in Europe, principally in France and the Netherlands. Post-Brexit, Class B waters, we weren't able to export at all. So quite a sort of existential change to our activities. 2021 and 2022, we weren't able to access that market whatsoever. This year, as Lewis touched upon, we have one area which is designated as a seasonal Class A, which has allowed us to sell and to derive some income. It's been a difficult few years. What would happen if the water quality wasn't improved? Well, interestingly enough, in different parts of Europe, particularly in Sweden, mussels have been used as what's called a natural bioremediator, where instead of being grown for food, they're being used to filter polluted water and out the environment in a more cost-effective, natural way than would be otherwise done. So no tertiary treatment plants were necessary. But beyond that, that's it. So back onto the slides that Lewis showed this one before. So we're in the Menai Strait. There's lots of catchment inputs. It's quite remarkable. I was thinking actually as Lewis was talking, Given the number of inputs to the area, it's quite remarkable that the classification that we have in the Menai Strait is as good as it is, and that's down to the flow that was mentioned before. This is what makes the Menai Strait unique. It's what brings the biodiversity to the area and helps maintain it. It's just the geographical structure of the Menai Strait allows this enormous amount of flushing to occur on a twice daily basis, which perhaps masks some of the sort of wider kind of ecosystem issues which are occurring, but anyway, it allows huge amounts of protein to be pushed down the strait, which bivalve filter feeders gorge themselves on, and as do other filter feeding organisms that exist within it. This is my last one. So we have these 6 monitoring areas inside the strait, which are supposed to provide a profile of the bacterial loading of the mussels that we grow in the area. They're sampled 13 times a year. Pre-Brexit, we were aware of the variations and vagaries of some of the sampling times. Post-Brexit, obviously, this issue has become much higher in our mind, and so we've been looking in much more detail, much more sort of granularity at the location of these monitoring points and how they then relate back to where the mussels are actually grown. And we hope to sort of over time change some of these monitoring points to make them more representative of the harvesting areas that we utilise. And I'm sorry that that's more rambling, but that's my sort of summary. And closing on a joke, there's no joke. Thank you very much.
I'll stay till the end because it's been a really fascinating discussion, and I think it's getting that focus that's going to be really important for this group. There are lots of different interests here. I agree, absolutely, we need to get sort of land managers and farmers as part of the group. I think we could very easily get bogged down in seeking new fishery orders or legislation, and having worked with Swan and MSFOMA and others.
Started in the 70s, but to carry on, that's all.
I mean, things move very, very slowly and frustratingly when it comes to that kind of thing. But if we can, I think, tie up the sort of the environmental, the community, and the economic as well is really important. I think. And build something that really shares information and gathers aspirations from people within the community. I think there's a making of something really useful.